Fesca ma, ha mi mewn tollage of seo conver an nok, agus ha mi noch is govi ma aking seo an nok. Welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to be here with you tonight. My name is Sally Reynolds. I am one of the Scottish Land Commissioners and I'm going to be your chair for this evening. The most important thing to note is that the webinar is being recorded. You are very welcome to leave your cameras on, but you're also very welcome to turn them off if you prefer not to be seen on the video. We're going to kick off just now. I'll go through the agenda in just a minute. We will aim to finish no later than 8:30. That is my job, to let you all away to get a cup of tea or enjoy the rest of your evening at 8:30, and I will endeavour to do that. Our privacy notice is linked and it's there on the screen as well. All participants are very welcome to ask questions. The purpose of these meetings is for us to tell you a little bit about the Land Commission, but more importantly, it's for us to hear from you, to hear about the things that matter to you and hear about your views on land reform. So please do ask questions. These can be done in the chat function, or they can be done by raising your hand after a short presentation, which will follow shortly. If you'd just like to start by telling us in the chat box where you are or what you hope to get from this evening, we'd love to hear that too. I will just do a very brief introduction just now of who everybody is. So as I said, my name's Sally Reynolds. I'm one of the Land Commissioners. I'm joined tonight by Andrew Thinn, who is the chair of the Land Commission board, and we're also joined by Hamish Trench, who's our chief executive. So we're your panel this evening, the three of us. Most importantly, we are joined by Jess in the background, who is keeping us right, doing all the technical elements. So thank you very much to Jess for doing all the stuff behind the scenes. What we're going to do in the format of the evening is I'm going to pass to Andrew shortly, who will run through a presentation for us. He'll introduce himself just before the beginning of the presentation, and then after the presentation we'll do another very quick introduction of who everybody on the panel is, and then it'll be over to you and we will be open for questions and we'll be really keen to hear from all of you. So I'm going to pass to Andrew now to run through the presentation.
Sally, thank you very much indeed. So what I'm trying to do here is just get us all onto the same page. So I'm going to really just skate through who we are, what we do. But the purpose of this evening, as Sally says, is to have I think a conversation is probably the best word. We want to discuss with you what we're doing, what we should be doing, what we might be doing in the future, what you think we should be doing in the future, all that sort of stuff. Of course, one thing that would be very helpful would be if there are particular things you want out of this evening, please at any point now or later, just type it into the chat so we know what you're looking for, because the last thing I want and we want is to get to 8:30 and discover that actually we didn't address the things that you wanted addressed. So please do just put something into the chat saying, you know, what I really want to talk about is such and such, or what I really want to understand is such and such, and that would be really helpful to us. Just to people sometimes sort of say, oh, well, you work in land reform, what on earth's that? It is worth just rehearsing this a wee bit. So traditionally, of course, people know that land reform has something to do with big landowners and power, and the fact that relatively few people own large scalps of land in Scotland. And a lot of people know that it's also about access to land for small, I was going to say small people, but that sounds pejorative, but people who want access to small bits of land to start a business or simply to have a wee bit of ground to do stuff on. It doesn't have to be a business. So that's sort of traditional view of land reform. And no question, a lot of our work is about that. Another traditional view of land reform is that it's something to do with tenancy. It's something to do with protecting tenants against abuses of power by landlords. And indeed sometimes protecting landlords against abuses of power by tenants. So it certainly is also about that. It's about tenant farming, it's about crofting, no doubt. But in the modern era, it's become about a lot of other things too, actually. So increasingly, over the next decade or so, land use in Scotland is going to be all about carbon capture, whether that's through woodland planting or through peatland restoration, or there may be other issues. And it's going to be about other restoring our environment, restoring our ecosystems. It's going to be about environmental credits and what's called natural capital. So how we do that in a fair and just way it has become a big land reform priority, really quite suddenly. And another thing that people may not be less cited on, but which we have majored on over the last 5 years, is the way in which Scotland handles the fact that we have large chunks of vacant and derelict land around some of our big cities and large numbers of vacant and derelict buildings in Scotland, including actually in Inverness, but particularly around the big conurbations further south. And that's become a big issue, really. People, why are these places allowed to sit vacant derelict? They're damaging. They're a blight in many ways on society. What can we do about it? And that photograph is actually a good example of what can be done with these sorts of sites. I think people probably know in the last 10 years, community ownership has again come from almost nowhere to be an extraordinarily big part of land reform. Where Sally lives in the Western Isles, 75% of people now live on community-owned land. An extraordinary statistic. And you think that that's come from almost zero only a decade or two ago. But it's not just about land. Communities are saying, actually, we don't particularly necessarily need to own land, but we want to own, it might be a small piece of land, a piece of woodland, or it might be a building. It might be the public toilets, it might be a bridge, it might be a cinema if you're at Cromarty, it's about all sorts of things. So that whole thing about communities suddenly almost being kind of empowered to take ownership and in doing so, therefore taking on power and taking on responsibility. I think the next decade or two might well see much harder thinking about new ways of owning land, new forms of tenure, new forms of governance. You go to some other countries, the idea that one person would own land would be rather odd. Actually, they have structures that allow different people to own different rights in the same piece of land. That would be quite normal. And actually in Scotland, we've had, over the last 100 years or so, we have tried various things with bits of legislation, and that's actually there was a hutting movement in Scotland for a while, which has largely fizzled out. It's my granny's hut, actually. So that's interesting. We had a Small Holdings Act in 1911, which has largely fizzled out. But many people outside the Crofton counties tell us that what they want is access to small holdings, and we need to find a way of making small holdings available in the whole of Scotland, not just in the Crofton counties. So I think we'll see interesting ways forward there, including new sorts of governance structures where actually, instead of one person or one company owning a piece of land, there'll be a structure in place. And there's one or two already. There's in Noida, it's a good example where you've got a number of different, the community and the charity and so on involved in the ownership structure. The same is true on Egg, same is true on Harris. We're experimenting with these things, and I think we'll see more of this. And Hamish and the team are doing some quite hard thinking about what that could look like in Scotland, learning from what we do in other countries. You can't avoid the issue of tax with land, because rather more than half of the nation's wealth is tied up in land. And we've done a bit of work on this, and we've published some advice. And essentially what we said was, look, we don't really tax this wealth very much, and maybe we should be thinking more about how we tax this wealth. And certainly some people tell me that the reason they own land is to protect their wealth from tax. So that speaks for itself, I think. And of course, the public purse supports land use enormously. Forestry is very well known, but less well known is the fact that the government committed millions and millions of pounds to peatland restoration, for example, and of course support historically for food production, agriculture, and so on. So how we do that, it's your money that's being spent supporting these land uses. So how we do that needs a lot of things. And I do want to just separate housing out from all the rest of it because it is so important. It's very clear to us, and we published some advice and we published some more yesterday. It is very clear to us that we're not getting the issue of land for housing right in Scotland yet. And the evidence for that, actually, the best piece of evidence I've ever seen is a graph that shows the rise of house prices over the last 25 years. And you can, if you draw a line for the rise in the cost of building the house, and then you draw a line for the price of the house, those lines are not parallel at all. And the reason for that is that the cost of building a house has largely risen in line with inflation, as you would expect. But the cost of the land underneath the house has risen way ahead of inflation. And that's why houses, since my wife and I bought our house, houses have way exceeded inflation, which is great for us, but not great for our children, and not great for an awful lot of other people. So we need to address that. We really do. So the Land Commission was set up by Parliament in 2017. We're relatively new. We were set up very deliberately to provide advice and recommendations on land reform to government, but not just to government, to others as well, including to landowners themselves. We're a national organisation. We cover the whole of Scotland, but we're a very small organisation. We're only 15 staff. So we don't have, we don't have somebody in Ullapool, somebody in Inverness, somebody in Edinburgh. We've got a small team, mostly in Inverness, and we focus on that national remit. We don't have a particularly regional remit. Parliament has said to us very clearly in law, actually, that we are to publish every 3 years and lay it before Parliament a plan as to what we're going to do for the next 3 years. And that's how Parliament, if you like, keeps control of us, which is a good thing, because that democratic link's a good thing. So we publish 3-year strategic plans every 3 years, and we're just finalising one for the next 3 years. I'll come on to that a wee bit. The work we do is based on a very fundamental concept, but it's one that's hugely important. It's right at the start of the 2016 Land Reform Act that set us up. And it is this, that if you wish to own land, rights in land in Scotland, then with those rights go responsibilities. The two are inseparable. You cannot think that you can come into Scotland, or indeed already be in Scotland, and buy land rights and just exercise those rights willy-nilly. With those rights go responsibilities. It's a fundamental concept that drives everything in a way that we do. And it's a fundamental concept that I think the Parliament, history will judge the Parliament pretty well for setting that basic premise in law in 2016. The strategic plan that we're just coming to the end of, I'm just going to skate through a bit of that because I think it gives you a feel for what we've been doing over the last 3 years. I'm not going to talk about before 2020. It doesn't seem a lot of point in that unless you want to, but it'll give you a feel for what we've been doing. And then in the conversation we have when I've finished this, you can get a feel, we can have a conversation about what we're going to do next. So a big part of the last 3 years has been doing the research that government asked us to do because they wish to put further land reform legislation in place next year, specifically aimed at tackling the issue of concentrated land ownership, the fact that so few people own so much of Scotland. It was a manifesto commitment, and government said to us very, very clearly, we need you to do the research, do some very hard thinking on this, and make recommendations to us. So we did that. Essentially, our advice was a range of things, but it was all about strengthening the emphasis on responsibilities. In other words, on controlling the power that goes with land ownership. People often talk about, well, she has all the, so many thousand acres, or he has, so many thousand acres over there. Actually, the thing that matters is the power that goes with those acres, the power to decide how those acres are used or not used, and therefore the power to influence our economy, jobs, people, lives, landscapes, scenery, wildlife, and all the rest of it. It's an extraordinary set of powers that go with ownership, and therefore an extraordinary set of responsibilities that go with land ownership. We've also recommended that there should be a public interest test when land changes hands if it's over some sort of threshold. There has to be some sort of threshold, although of course all thresholds are arbitrary in a way. And that's not a novel idea. There's many other countries in Europe that do this. I think I counted 18 countries across Europe that have some sort of public interest test when land changes hands. So it's not a novel idea, but it's novel in Scotland. Government published a consultation paper called Land Reform in a Net Zero Nation. That's all on the internet. And they are going to publish a draft land reform bill, I'm told, before Christmas, which will, I don't know, we don't know exactly what will be in that, but it's likely to follow what they said in the consultation paper. So it's exciting times, actually. We've done a lot of work on this whole business of community ownership because it is so important and it's moving so fast in Scotland, and because government has linked the whole business of ownership with empowerment. In other words, the antidote to the concentration of power is to empower communities. So we've done a lot of work on that recently. The idea is actually not new. I first worked on community ownership in the early 1990s. At a time when it was entirely crowdfunded from private individuals. There was no public money. There is now a Scottish Land Fund as well as crowdfunding. As I say, 75% of people in the Western Isles on community-owned land. It's all sorts of different things. There is legislation in place called the Community Right to Buy. That's what CRTB means. I strongly urge that it is only used if it absolutely has to be, because there are human rights. The ECHR stands for European Convention of Human Rights. If the vast majority of community purchases, community acquisitions are through willing buyer, willing seller agreement, and actually, quite often, not all that often, but quite often, landowners decide that they either want to gift it to the community ownership, or perhaps give it at some subsidised rate. So there's and there is a role, I think, for landowners in that. And Lord MacLeod, who's one of our commissioners, chairs a leadership group around that to keep the whole thing moving. It's worked pretty well. It's not without its wrinkles. You may want to talk about that. Increasingly, people are saying to us, and landowners in particular, but also communities are saying to us, well, it's all very well saying that with land rights go responsibilities, but what does responsible look like? And it's a fair question, actually, because I think the answer to that does slightly depend on your point of view. So we have been attempting to spell out what responsible looks like through protocols, through tools, through guidance, and all the rest of it. And I think that will be, we'll see what the bill contains, but there's certainly been strong hints in the consultation that government intends to make that rather more binding on the bigger landowners. So that rather than being a protocol, there'll be a code of practice of some sort. But we don't know. And certainly at the moment, there's no legal basis for these protocols. We've invented them, we've written them. Most landowners have followed them, to be fair. And in fact, Scottish Lands and Estates, the sort of umbrella body for landowners, is on the record as saying that these protocols are the scripts that landowners should follow. So that's encouraging. Of course, there's a small number of landowners who cock a snoot at all this, and it's extremely irritating. And they get all the press coverage. And that is very annoying. We must deal with that. We can't live in a country where the majority behave decently and a minority just think they can do what they like. The Tenant Farming Commissioner role was invented in the 2016 legislation. It's been really successful. We forget that the relationship between landowners and tenant farmers, when there was a review of this in 2014. At that point, relations were pretty appalling, actually. There were examples from all over the country, terrible conflict. Tenant Farming Commissioner was created. Bob McIntosh, who's in that picture, was put into the job. He's put a raft of codes of practice in place which do have statutory underpinning, a legal basis. He's also put some superb mediation things in place, so that it's not just about beating people over the head. And he's also actually done some really excellent work, almost as a side issue, on trying to support new entrants into farming, which is all part of this business of access to land. So that's been a very successful area of work. The natural capital stuff, carbon, you may well want to talk about this, but we've done a bit of work on it. The whole thing's moving very fast, but it's based on this idea that if you plant trees, or if you restore peatland, or if you restore biodiversity, you may be able to get essentially payments, credits, income for doing so. And some of that is more advanced than others. So first, the forestry woodland carbon is relatively well advanced, peatland carbon less so, and the biodiversity is still somewhat theoretical, but it's undoubtedly happening. Because a lot of people believe it's happening, there's been a huge rise of land prices, land doubling, trebling, quadrupling in value in some places, because speculators are thinking, haha, we'll buy that piece of rubbishy old peat bog for next to nothing, and we'll restore it and get a heap of carbon credits and make a fortune. So a lot of speculative investment going on. That does risk bring less for local communities, because it doesn't follow that there will be good quality jobs in these places. It doesn't follow that communities will share in this bonanza. It might actually only be the speculators who may not even live in Scotland who benefit. So finding ways of making this fair and just and locally beneficial have been big challenges to us. We've given advice to Scottish Government. We've given advice to investors. Will it be a just transition? Frankly, the jury's out yet. I don't think we know, but it's a big issue. And vacant and derelict land, I've mentioned before, it is a major urban issue. There are numerous rural sites. I had a quick look at the Inverness bit of it, and it's available online. Have a look at it. But it's quite surprising how many of the sites there are in Inverness. There's quite a few on the Longman, there's Scorguria, Bennett, and so on. These are all sites that are on that register. So if you have an interest in it, have a look at it. Housing I've mentioned earlier, but I'm just going to a wee bit more. So we've published various bits of advice. The central issue is that land is not being brought forward for housing at a pace and in a way that reflects societal needs. It's being brought forward in a way that suits the needs of the people who own the big house building companies and their shareholders. And so we need, I think, a public sector that is more assertive, that has more control over this, because otherwise, I'm not criticizing house building companies. They're in the business of making money for shareholders. But when you've got a house building market that's dominated by a handful of players, power is far too concentrated, and that's not in the public interest. So we've said that. Tax may well be a big area of work for us in the future. We've not done an awful lot just in the last year or so, but we did do quite a bit. Tax can be used to influence the way people behave, so it can be used to influence policy ambitions. It can also, of course, be used to raise money to pay for schools and hospitals. So it has two possible dimensions. We've made some recommendations. I think this may be an area of future work. We'll see. We're about to finalise and submit to the Minister what we think we want to do 23 to 26, and that will have to be laid before Parliament. Now, this is not finalised, and actually I'd be quite interested in your thoughts, but here's a flavour of what we think we're going to say. We're going to divide it under three headings: people, power, and prosperity. Those are the three things that we think matter at the moment around land reform. First and foremost, we need to do better in Scotland to enable people to participate and influence decisions about land, because time and time again at meetings like this, people tell us, I'm fed up with this. I have no influence over what's happening around about me. I can't get access to a wee bit of land. I don't know why those trees are going, so on and so forth. So that's priority one. Priority two, power is too concentrated. I don't think we can get away from that. And I don't know actually anyone who seriously disagrees with this. It's land ownership, pattern of land ownership in Scotland is more concentrated than anywhere else in Western Europe. We need to diversify that power. We need to modulate that power. We need to put governance mechanisms in place so that power is exercised responsibly and not in the hands of one person. So there's a whole raft of stuff that I think we can do over the next 3 years to try and deal with this issue of power, only one of which is reducing the size of landholding. There are big charitable landowners, for example. Now, it may be in the public interest for them to hold those big bits of land, but if that's the case, let's make sure that the governance of that charity and that land management is such that power is properly shared. And lastly, but by no means least in current circumstances, we really need to make the most of our land for our economic prosperity. And, currently I don't think it is. It's very difficult, for example, for people to, innovative young people to get a bit of land and get moving. Agriculture, for example, is dominated by people who are over 55. It's a lot of people who exercise decision-making power over land use are not particularly well trained, and they may just have inherited the thing. So we need to think much harder about how do we ensure that the land that we have in Scotland is used to best effect, some of which will be social, some of which will be environmental, but economic prosperity in many respects underpins social and environmental as well. And lastly, we will continue to try and have influence on a UK stage. We're here to advise in Scotland, but of course, a lot of what we're talking about applies just as much to England and Wales and Ireland, Northern Ireland. And of course, some of the things we're talking about are matters that are reserved to Westminster, especially tax. So we'll continue to play on that UK stage and not just a Scottish stage. So that, I think, Sally, is enough from me, but just so that everyone has these things, we now have an absolutely superb website with masses and masses of really interesting stuff that's accumulated over the last 5 years there. So please use it. There must be something for everyone to read it. And please, if you would like to contact us, there is a phone number there or an email address. And I mean, I'll maybe just say it now, Sally, if that's all right. I mean, if anyone wants to talk to one of us, but you don't want to talk on a sort of public platform like this for whatever reason, then of course, send us an email and we'll phone you and have a chat, because I totally understand that the conversation that we're about to have may be difficult if you want to talk about things that in some way are sensitive. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That's great, and it's given us a really good overview and start to the meeting. So I'm just going to do a wee repeat of housekeeping before we start the panel session. So just a reminder to everybody that the webinar is being recorded. You're more than welcome to leave your cameras on, but if you would prefer to turn them off, that's absolutely fine. Another thing to note is, in the past in these sessions, what we've done is when a particular topic has come up, our comms team have very helpfully put the links into the chat. We had some feedback that people found that a little bit confusing and hard to follow and too much to take in during the meetings. So what we've done for this session is they've been put together into one useful page, and that's just been put up in the chat. So just to note that there's lots and lots and lots of information there. So rather than you getting lots of different links through the chat, it's all there in one place for you. And on that point about feedback, we always want feedback. We always want to hear from you. We always want to try and make these sessions better. And it was some feedback that led us to making that change. And I hope it'll work really well going forward. But so to help with that, we will put a survey link in towards the end of the meeting. Jess will put that in the chat at the appropriate time, and it will also be emailed out to you. And please do give us your feedback, because we always want to try and make things better. So before we kick off with the questions, I'm going to ask the panel members to very briefly introduce themselves. I know that you've heard from Andrew, but I just think it's very good to hear a couple of sentences from people on their background, just to let you understand it. So I'm going to ask Hamish to start and then pass to Andrew.
Hello everyone, hi, I'm Hamish Trench. I'm the Chief Executive at the Scottish Land Commission, so I lead the staff team. We've got a small team of staff, around 16 or so people, most of whom are based in and around Inverness, and I live just a wee bit south in Grantown-on-Spey. So good to join you tonight.
Thanks very much, Hamish. And Andrew, just a couple of sentences.
Yeah, sorry, I should have introduced myself at the beginning. Forgive me.
No.
So, yeah, Andrew Thin. So I'm chairman of the Scottish Land Commission at the moment. I'm also a crofting commissioner. If anyone wants to talk about crofting, let's not let that dominate the meeting. Previously, chaired Scottish Canals, chaired Scottish Natural Heritage, chaired the Cairngorm National Park Authority. So done different things in my life.
Thanks very much. And I'm Sally Reynolds. I'm one of the 6 Scottish Land Commissioners. I'm based out in the Hebrides on the Isle of Lewis. I am a crofter. I live on a community-owned estate, and I did until 2 months ago work for a community landowner. So I have been entrenched in community land ownership for quite some time, especially for the last 8 years of my life. And I've recently changed to a new role, but as always, land comes into everything. So so it's really interesting to go into a new sector and learn about different stuff. So thank you to you all tonight for joining us. We've got a couple of really good questions in the chat already, so I'm going to jump straight to them. But please do put more questions in the chat, and please do raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. So I'm going to put the first question to Hamish, and it's quite a big question, but I thought it was really interesting. So I just wondered if you could give a bit of a reflection on, we're in quite an interesting kind of policy landscape at the moment. We're in very difficult times in terms of, we're in a climate emergency, but we've got net zero targets as a country, but we also know that we have housing crises, and people are living in really difficult times from prosperity. So Ben's asked an interesting question there just about how all these different things balance and how difficult that can be in terms of land reform. So I just wanted to ask you, Hamish, to give a wee bit of a reflection on that and kind of how difficult it is in this competing policy landscape.
Okay, I'll try and offer a few thoughts on that. And I think, it's a good question, because I think there's no doubt actually that we're asking more and more of our land in Scotland, as indeed probably in other parts of the world as well, particularly as we try and address the climate crisis, the nature crisis. Scotland has big ambitions to change and transform its economy. So we're asking quite a lot of land, and actually often of the same bits of land, particularly in upland Scotland. We see kind of increasing demand for the same bits of land for forestry expansion, for example, for peatland restoration, for farming, for rewilding, still for more traditional sporting use in some cases. So there are parts of Scotland, particularly upland Scotland, where the competing demands for land are quite significant in terms of different land uses, and they're also, as Andrew highlighted earlier, actually driving land prices as well. So that has an effect, obviously, in terms of prices for land. We see low supply, high demand. Prices, not surprisingly, are going higher and higher at the moment. I think one of the interesting questions is how do you balance that? And I think we're pretty clear that actually at a national scale, I'm not sure you can reconcile all of these objectives neatly. And probably you can't do it at an individual landholding scale either. So I think some of the work we've done is actually how could you bring more local accountability, more democracy, more democratic decision-making to these choices, and what scale would work? And some of our work has certainly suggested that a more regional approach to looking at land use priorities, how you manage the trade-offs, the choices, and how you make those more accountable locally ought to be a big theme ahead in Scotland.
Thanks, Hamish. And I'm going to pass to Andrew now for another question here that's come in that's really interesting, actually. And it's about community ownership. And it's talking about, so I live in a part, as Andrew said, I live in a part of the country where community ownership is starting to feel normal. I'm not saying it's starting to feel easy, and cannot still be challenging, but it's starting to feel normal. But I think there's a really good question in the chat about how within an urban context, it can seem like much more of a challenge. And Inverness has started to see some really good examples, and I would agree with that. But this Maria's raising an interesting question here of how can awareness and good practice be raised? And that's not just from private landowners, but that would also be with public landowners as well. So just, I guess, how can we raise the profile within an urban context and help to move things forward in scenarios where it's the right way forward? So over to you for that one, Andrew.
Okay, thanks, Sally. Hi, Maria. Actually, one thing I was going to say, Sally, is if people want to talk with the hand raised, that might. I'm certainly struggling to keep track of all the chat. So, but I think I know where Maria's coming from because she said it to me before. So I mean, the sort of glib answer is to say, well, we've already got protocols, and the land reform bill that's coming may well make those protocols into codes, and if they are made into codes, they will become obligatory on larger landowners, and the question will then become, So is a public agency likely to be a large landowner? And I think the answer is almost certainly yes, because most public agencies own quite a scalp of staff. So that's the kind of easy answer. You know, the Highland Council becomes subject to codes, and there will be a code to follow. There already is a protocol to follow on what you do if communities want to buy something. However, I actually think there's something much more profound here, which is that we are still in the early stages of a pretty fundamental cultural shift in a direction of travel in which it will become normal for communities not just to do things, but to believe that they can do things, and therefore it will become normal to expect communities to do things, and we're simply not there yet. There are lots of reasons why things happen very fast in the Western Isles that are not replicated, not least the fact that the bulk of the land we're talking about is in crofting tenure, and crofting townships by definition tend to be more organized around communal initiative already. And probably there were more willing sellers there too. So it would be wrong to sort of say, oh, well, you know, everyone else is just dragging their heels. Actually, I think the rest of Scotland is simply at an earlier stage because it's more difficult in other parts of Scotland. Tools that we could use. I'm not sure that there are tools. There are bound to be things we could do that we're not doing. But I mean, I don't know what they are, because if I knew what they are, if I knew what they were, I'd be doing them. But what I definitely do think is that there is a huge amount of activity now on social media that's talking about this sort of stuff all the time. So I think awareness is actually growing very speedily. And I probably, if I had to prioritize, I wouldn't say that awareness is the challenge. It's confidence to do stuff. Your group, Maria, and you know, you actually took on something particularly difficult with that woodland project, because on the face of it, it didn't belong to anybody. But that took courage, it took organization, it took self-confidence, and I think that, you know, that still has to build a long way. But why don't you come back and say what you think, Maria? Is that all right, Sally? Because she could use the hand button.
Just unmute Maria if you'd like to talk.
Yeah, no, that's and it's great to see all the work that the Land Commission is doing. You know, suppose where it was coming from is that it is as important, I think, for urban communities to have a bit of influence and access to land as well, and the challenges are slightly different than in rural areas. But I do think that, you know, one of the key things is making sure the community empowerment legislation is working, and there is some leverage there to push the, you know, authorities that are not following some of the procedures. So there's maybe an aspect there, you know, that I think, you know, maybe even doing some research to understand better which public bodies are better and worse might be something to consider. Certainly we hear that there's some organizations that are quite good and others that are not as good, but that's I think you know, really encouraging to hear that this is a topic in general that you're looking at, you know, for your next program as well of work. So that might be I've got Gordon is another director, part of the Knocknageal Community Asset Transfer. I don't know whether, since we're on this topic, whether he wants to say anything.
Go on, Gordon.
Well, oh, there you are.
Yes, good evening all. Yes, I think I came to the Knocknageal Limited project fairly late 2021, which in itself is quite a comment. The 2021 should be late in a project that still hasn't had a decision, speaks for itself. I think if there's one single thing that really hit me about the process, looking at the planning process and the application, as Maria was alluding to, the practical application of the community rights via legislation, is how incredibly difficult it seemed for the community to actually have a meaningful voice in the process. So we have planning legislation that goes in its particular way, which appeared, I emphasize appeared to me, to be all about housing and or industrial use. But where in all that was the locus for community involvement, for communities to reflect on what sort of place they wanted to live on, how could they input to the process? And the whole idea that you cannot create communities simply by building housing. There has to be a great deal more than that taken into consideration. You know, we're waiting at the moment for a decision on our particular case, and clearly we would like it to go the right way. But I think, from my point of view, I would also be delighted if one of the upshots of this particular case, and indeed the Land Commission's work, is to somehow ensure that other community groups do not have to go through this again. You know, the process has been incredibly long-winded, very fraught at times, and has tested the patience not just of the directors in Knock Gale, but of the numerous supporters within the community, who many of whom will be wondering what on earth the point is in their being involved at all, when the process seems to grind on and on, with often long periods when there's no sense that the community actually has an input to the end result. So I guess just having this question of the community input raised is to me absolutely key. It's not just about community rights at the end of a process. It's about how communities are involved. And by communities, I mean communities and people from communities, not simply at the level of councillors, the political, if you like, input, which inevitably has an element of party politics in it, but how the voices of communities can be taken into effect, whilst also accepting that, you know, housing is a very real need. We can't ignore it, but you can't build a community solely on housing.
Thanks, Gordon. And that's actually I'm smiling when I'm listening to you, not because it's such a familiar story and we hear this so often. I just want to ask Hamish for some reflections on that, both in terms of kind of the planning process, but also on the kind of community engagement and the community, you kind of getting into volunteer fatigue and things like that there. So just a little bit from Hamish on that would be really good, and some reflections. I don't want us to talk about specific cases, but just in general, Hamish.
Yeah, no, Gordon, Maria, it's helpful to hear your experience on that. And I think it's certainly not unique. I mean, I can certainly be upfront in the research we did a few years ago on the community asset transfer provisions, which is the way that public bodies go about this, found that there was a very patchy approach to how they were implemented. Far from consistent. There were some really good examples, some really good practice, and there were some areas certainly that made it very difficult for communities. And where, you know, barriers that weren't actually required in the legislation appeared to be getting in the way. So I think there is still some work to be done on kind of teasing that out. One of the important things I would say is that the government is reviewing the Community Empowerment Act at the moment. So now is absolutely the right time to make sure that you're feeding your experience into that in terms of lessons learned and practical changes that could be made to those processes and to the rules that guide it. And then on the wider sort of link to planning, I think, I mean, clearly those kind of, I mean, that is exactly what the planning system should be doing, is taking those perspectives and views on the different uses. There is an opportunity now increasingly with local councils to develop local place plans, and actually we think there's a big opportunity there for communities to have a more of a leadership role in actually shaping those local place plans. And again, that would be something that would be well worth pursuing and making the case to be involved in doing that.
Thanks, Hamish. I'm going to now ask Alistair if he'd like to come in with his question, and then we may come back to this topic later, but just I'm not sure if it's on the same topic or a different one, Alistair.
Thanks, Sally. Make my position known to those who don't know me here. I am Alistair McNabb. I'm farming at Kildun Farm, which is at the roundabout beside Maryborough, below Dingwall Mart. I'm a veterinary surgeon who's worked all my life in the Highlands and the Islands. And I'm also now currently Vice President of the National Farmers Union of Scotland. And I'm past chair of the Legal and Technical Committee at National Farmers Union of Scotland. And we worked pretty closely with Andrew and Hamish over the last number of years. Our teams have in looking at these policies and how it's affected our members. What I would like to raise a minute in very particular is Gordon has actually crystallised what the conflicting issues had here in Scotland. And you have a community here who's focused on a piece of ground which would be absolutely actually beneficial to that community to have that piece of ground at Knocknagale. The conflict with this is there are several hundred other communities to whom that piece of ground is equally and maybe even more valuable, in as much as that ground produces the quality of oats that are required to go as part of the ration to feeding the bulls in that bull stud, which go out. There's 120, 130 bulls go out each year. They will produce an average 30 calves each. So you're looking at 3,500 calves out of that at an average price of £800–900 a piece. We're talking of a massive economic value to the Highlands and the Islands. Now, there are no rights and wrongs either side of this. A community has identified an interest and a need. I have no issue with that. The union has no issue with that. Crofters have got a want and need. The problem the Scottish Land Commission has here is balancing the needs of all the communities of Scotland. And that is the big, big issue, the big picture we need to discuss. And I know Andrew's on board with this because we've had discussions with him. And Andrew, I apologise to you because you and I have never actually managed to sit down over a cup of coffee and get round these principles, but we'll get it done shortly. It's just life is just going too fast. And the same goes to Hamish. But we've got to engage in a number of issues that every community has in Scotland. And the rural community is a valid community. It's not an opposing community. It's part of that community. And when the further west you get, the agricultural and farming and crofting communities become more and more important in the supporting of rural communities. If there's no money in them, there's no profit in them, there's nothing to support you. The amount of money that goes into these communities and the benefit is enormous. Now, we share a huge amount of concern that the Scottish Land Commission and everybody here has tonight in the issues that we're all raising. But we need to have a way forward. One of our key issues, and we've raised this with the Scottish Land Commission, we've raised it with the Scottish Government, is a community decides they want to do something. Now, that community is different from an individual landowner. You can identify that individual. You get a community, it sets up, and that community goes up, something happens. 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Has that community actually got a succession plan in place, like we farmers and landowners have to have now with the Scottish Government agriculture bill that's coming in? They're looking for succession plans. How is that community going to have that succession? Is it going to die out? What contingencies in place to keep it going? And that is one of the big issues that is fundamentally facing Scotland, is how do we keep this going? Because a community is only the people who are here and now doing it. How do you get your enthusiasm onto the next generation and the next generation? And I see where Maria is coming in towns in Inverness, and that is something that we've really got to address, is how do we create real communities and real bonding with people in our towns and villages? How do we build that bridge into the rural community to understand our different priorities, our different interests, our different ways of life? There's a huge gap, and I believe the Scottish Land Commission has a big role to play in building this gap and understanding. And coming back to what Hamish started off with, Andrew started at the beginning, you talked about people wanting access to small holdings. Anything you do in life, or anything you want to do in life, somebody has done it before you. Go and find them, ask them how they did it. This country did this just over 100 years ago after World War I. The government went and bought farms, split them up into small holdings and gave folk a start. Why is that not an option today for the Scottish Land Commission? If you wish to own land, it comes with the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. We don't have an issue with that, but that Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement has to go across every single person who accesses or uses land in Scotland. Everybody's got a right, but that comes with responsibilities. And one of our concerns as a union is these responsibilities are not being accepted or implemented by others who use our land.
Can I, sorry, Alistair, can I stop? Sorry, Alistair. Sorry, Alistair, I'm just going to stop you there just so we can get
I'm on a sermon. I'm on a sermon.
I'm just going to stop you there just so that we can get a few bits, so I can get some feedback from the panel on your points, if that's okay. And I don't want us to delve too much. I really appreciate you coming in, and I felt there that you actually gave in with you were very good to kind of balance your views there, and you put that across really well. And I don't want us to spend too much of the evening on one particular case, because I want us to move on to other things as well. But I am going to ask Andrew just to come back on.
It was just that case has highlighted a lot of the key issues.
I know, I completely understand that, and I think it's really, really interesting, and I think it brings it's actually a good segue into quite a lot of our earlier discussion on our, you know, we're seeing a lot of issues between policy areas. We're also seeing a lot of issues between urban and rural just now, and I think it is, as you say, it's a really good case to highlight issues. So I'm going to ask Andrew just for his reflections on that. As you haven't managed to sit down with a cup of coffee, we're going to have you can give a bit of a reflection now, Andrew, and then I'm going to move on to a couple of the other questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, I get that, Sally. We'll need to move on because otherwise this could dominate the entire evening. But so let me say, two or three things to say. First of all, if you want to see some of the finest cattle in Scotland, cycle past Alistair's farm. They are superb. Secondly, I actually agree with everything that Alistair said.
What's that going to cost me, Andrew?
It'll cost you a coffee. The second thing to say is I absolutely agree with actually everything that Alistair said, and I think, you know, what I find really encouraging about all of this is that nobody's shying away from some pretty difficult issues. The NFUS is engaging really constructively with Land Commission and many others. So I'm actually really very optimistic, Alistair, that we will get these things right. Of course, there will be wrinkles. Of course, there will be bumps. But I think you've got a lot of actually very sensible people behaving very sensibly. And that matters because there is always a risk in this, and you know this more than most. There's always a risk that this somehow gets hijacked by some wider political agenda, and you go, it goes off at a tangent. So I am optimistic because of the way things are going. I would suggest, Sally, we don't spend the entire evening talking about Not the Gale, tempting though it might be.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to move on to another question now. We may find ourselves coming back to that, and that's fine. But I'm just going to move on to a couple of other questions. I had to absolutely smile as you were talking there, because in the village where I live, we are having an anniversary next year of 100 years of crofters being given a broken up farm. So yeah, land reform is alive and well, and I'm living on one of those crofts. And I'm going to ask Hamish now to talk about this question that's come from Patricia, which I think is really interesting, which is, how is the work going on knowing who actually owns pieces of land? So there's some quite interesting stuff to talk about that. And I'm just going to ask Hamish if he can give us a bit of an update on some of that work that's happened around that, and not necessarily Land Commission work, but just the wider context with that.
Yeah, it's a core question, isn't it? Of can you actually find out who owns a bit of land that you're interested in for whatever reason? And well, I don't know if it's surprising or not, but actually quite a few inquiries that we get to our good practice team are still about difficulties in finding out who owns land and how you find out the ownership. So I think, as some of you probably know, the government kind of is committed through Registers of Scotland, who hold the land register, to getting essentially all land on that land register over time. They're more than halfway there at the moment, but there's still big gaps in it. There is both kind of geographical and type of land ownership gaps in that. So they had an ambition to get there sort of mid-decade, I think, this decade. They're not quite there at the moment. What I think the other interesting thing, though, that they are doing, the land register is actually making a lot of their existing information much more easily available. So the information that's actually on the old register, the Register of Saisians, is actually becoming increasingly usable and available. And even though it might not be wholly accurate, often you don't need it to be wholly accurate if you're just trying to find out who owns a bit of land. So it's always worth a look on the Register of Scotland website, and called ScotList, Scotland's Land Information System, because they're adding information and making that more user-friendly regularly at the moment. So yeah, I think the answer is it's a work in progress. Unfortunately, we still do not have that complete kind of register and map of land ownership. But yeah, always worth a look on the Register of Scotland site as a first port of call.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Jess, for putting that link up in the chat there. I'm going to come to another question that's just come in on the chat, and that's thank you very much to Murray from this. He's coming in as a community council chair, and this is to ask about this tenancy. So Andrew did speak in his presentation earlier about different governance models, and so Andrew, this is just about this question of our whole discussion so far has been about ownership, and what work is the Scottish Land Commission doing about promoting tenancy as the norm? So we obviously have a tenant farming commissioner, and you were the interim tenant farming commissioner before, but more widely than that, so not just in a tenant farming context, but in a wider context, where are we talking about tenancy?
So we don't have a particular role, I think, to promote tenancy. We certainly are talking about it. I think I want to answer this question in two different ways. So first of all, I think it's important that we don't get ourselves tied up in this word tenancy. The work that we are doing is on different governance models for land, where rights become more shared, which is effectively what a tenancy is. I mean, a tenancy is simply sharing some of the rights with the owner. And in some types of tenancy, those rights are quite secure, as in a crofting tenancy. But there are other examples, particularly in Scandinavia, where multi-layered structures either allow different people to share the same rights or allow different people to subdivide the rights between them. And I guess the best analogy I would offer is in Scotland, where, for example, fishing rights are sometimes separated from ownership, grazing rights, which are separated from mineral rights and so on, but less so. So I think the governance work will tease some of that out, and it's still a work in progress, so I don't yet know what we'll conclude. The second part of the answer I want to offer is that I think, so this is slightly crystal ball stuff. I don't think it's the next 3 years, but I think we need to think harder about, and Alistair said it in a way, but when he made the point, we did all this stuff in 1911 and again after the First World War. Why can't, let's not reinvent wheels? I agree with Alistair about that, actually. But I think we're going to have to rethink our approach to smallholding tenancies in Scotland. We've got crofting tenure in the crofting counties, where roughly 10% of the population lives, and probably 0.5% are involved in crofting. 10% of the Scottish population. And then a large chunk of Scotland where we don't have the same type of secure smallholding tenure. I think Scotland's going to have to address that at some point. I don't have a clear answer for you, Mary, but I guess what I would like to see is, it'll probably be after I'm gone and buried, but I would like to see Scotland have a single system of small-scale, secure tenure that applies across the country, and isn't limited to the crofting counties, and which is sufficiently flexible to enable people to to enable it to be a genuine route for innovators into land management, which one of the things that really concerns me at the moment is the number of young people of my children's generation who just simply say, there's no way I'm going into agriculture because there's not the slightest hope that I'll ever get there unless I'm born into it. So I'm going to go and do something else. And that just seems to me a mistake for our country.
Thank you very much. We've had Alistair. I'm going to let you come in, Alistair, again, but you're not allowed to mention Knock the Gale, okay?
No, I mean, I'm moving on quickly here. There's a lot to cover here.
Yeah.
Going back to Hamish's point on Register of Scotland and ownership of land. This is moving far, far too slowly, and we would like to see the Scottish Land Commission really put serious pressure on the government. In my own instance, for example, I bought the farm from my parents in 2005. The title has been almost completed, and we're in 2023, and there's still bits to sort out. We were in meetings with utilities about powers of access to accessing land for the infrastructure that's got to go in for renewables. And they're telling us that they're going to farm tenants and they've no idea who actually owns the farm they're renting, and it's causing a lot of trouble. So this Register of Scotland and the Register of Controlling Interest, I would ask you, please, put a lot of pressure on the Scottish Government to really push this on rapidly with a very short-term deadline to get things up to date and put the money into it. Second thing, on Andrew Thinn's point about creating more crofts, etc. The thing that is there are two things blocking it. One is the current tax system, which we're addressing with Holyrood and Westminster. But the second thing is the policy of the absolute right to buy. And if you've inherited a place or you've bought a place and you reach an age that you maybe want to put someone in to take a tenancy for a number of years, the absolute right to buy is an absolute killer. It's not just landowners, but this could apply to communities as well. If communities is having difficulty with someone to run it, do they want that person to have an absolute right to buy and the community lose it? It's a big question, and we need to sort this out.
Sally, you're muted.
Sorry, muted myself there instead of unmuted. Thank you very much, Alistair. That was great. Two very succinct and good questions there, and I really appreciate them. And you will have noticed quite a lot of nodding from all three members of the panel with your first point. So I'm going to come to Andrew there on the absolute right to buy comment. I think in terms of the Register of Controlling Interests, I think you might underestimate our influence on that, but we do agree that we would like to see things move forward, and we will reiterate that point where and when we can.
Yeah, I suspect the NFUS have got more influence than we do, actually, Alistair, but we'll keep trying. The absolute right to buy.
Yourself.
We keep trying. The absolute right by on tenanted land, on Ag Holdings tenanted land, the absolute right to buy was considered carefully by the review panel in 2014, and we came out clearly and said that that was not a good idea. And it's very hard to do more than that because no government can tie the hands of a future government. That's how democracy works. So it is always going to be the case that our government could introduce an absolute right to buy. I don't think it's possible to get away from that. We did our best in 2014, and actually the subject is largely, I mean, I don't hear it discussed a lot in relation to Ag Holdings. In relation to crofting, of course, they do have the absolute right to buy and have done since 1970. Sorry, I've forgotten the date, but I think it was 75. And it is a big issue, there's no question. I mean, the whole business of owner-occupied crofts has become a very difficult complication that allows people to get around some of the regulatory means and so on and so forth. So I am absolutely clear that any new form of small holding legislation for the whole of Scotland needs to be clear from the start that it won't include a right to buy. But even then, I think we just have to accept that politics is an uncertain business, and you know, there is always the possibility that governments will do things. That's not what you want to hear, Alistair, I know.
That's the reality of life, unfortunately, Andrew, and we have to live with that. And that is one of the big blocks to land being let in the current environment. And we need to find a way around that.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think what we attempted to do in 2014 was to put the thing to bed as best we could, and I think we were reasonably successful. But I agree with that. There are other ways around it, of course, and what we're seeing is, more contract farming and all these sorts of things. And I think, I actually think that type of innovation is what we need to see more of, and also what the Land Commission needs to do some more serious thinking about. Hamish is nodding. Part of our job, I think, is to say, look, here's what you could do, and set out a range of different models, which we're bracketing and saying different governance models. But I think frankly we're starting with a blank piece of paper, and we'll see what we can come up with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Hamish, sorry, Sally, to cut across you. I wonder if it's worth asking Hamish, just a quick word on the governance work. It's not complete yet.
No, but I mean, on the agricultural context, particularly, we did publish some work a few years ago looking at alternative kind of governance forms, particularly joint ventures, and asked if with you and NFES colleagues who've looked at this before. I know, I think, Andrew, you're actually right in terms of use of tenancies, and traditional tenancies will inevitably be limited for a number of reasons now, but there's huge scope in other joint venture models, particularly for helping new entrants come into the sector. And there's some interesting examples of those. Absolutely get that still some barriers to getting those in place. And yeah, something we can continue to focus on, definitely.
Thanks, everybody. Sally, I'll try and contain myself.
No, thanks very much. And I'm not sure who owes who a cup of coffee, but I'm sure you can meet up soon to continue the conversation. I want to thank Ben for he's put in a number of questions, and we haven't got to them, and we're not going to get to them all. In terms of your question about how land reform can best support Gaelic and Scots as minority languages, I don't think our Gaelic language plan probably does delve into that level of detail in that way. But internally, we have been having some conversations recently about an event that starts to look at some of those questions and answer those questions, and which organisations we could work with to host that, and so on and so forth. So we have been trying to have some conversations internally about how we can do a little bit of innovative work on that. So watch out for something coming up fairly soon. In terms of your other question on education, again, with a small team, we have limited resources. We have had some work done previously on things like how to reach young people with land reform and how to spread the message. And I think we would all agree that we would like to do as much as we can in terms of education and engagement, but we are a small team, and there is only so much we can do within our current resources. In terms of your question here, I'm going to ask Hamish to speak about this. So we're not involved in the decisions that the Scottish Land Fund takes, obviously, but we have seen a shift in recent years in the type of buyouts that we're seeing coming through in that. And it is tending to be more asset focused. And this actually brings up some of the kind of rural urban debate again. And I think that's quite relevant to this evening and Inverness. So I just wondered if Hamish wanted to speak about that and that kind of balance and that change we're seeing in community ownership.
Thanks, Ben. It's a good question, and it's something actually that the community land leadership group that Andrew mentioned earlier has been thinking through itself recently as well. So there's no question that the Scottish Land Fund has broadened, and actually quite a significant proportion of its funding goes to, I suppose, what relatively small scale in area terms, and actually increasingly urban property asset transfers. Now that actually, in terms of the way the Land Fund operates and what it's been set out to do from Scottish Government, actually appears to be quite successful. It's a good way of funding those kind of community asset acquisitions, and of course they are actually making a significant impact in quite a high number of communities across Scotland. So I don't think there's anything difficult or wrong with that necessarily. I think there is an interesting question though, actually, what are the best ways now of supporting larger scale community land acquisitions, and particularly in a land market where prices are rising? And even with the doubling of the land fund in this parliament, prices are still rising significantly, so that even a £20 million land fund would obviously have limited power in terms of a large number of rural land acquisitions. I think over the years, the big scale acquisitions have always been the exception in terms of the land fund. But the kind of thinking that we've been developing more recently and discussing with enterprise companies, government and others is really about how do we move to a situation where the land fund is actually leveraging other funding and finance from different sources as well. So given that public finance will always be limited to an extent on this, how do we use that to best effect and actually bring in finance from other sources? And there's obviously a long tradition of philanthropic giving, charitable giving that supports community land acquisition. Increasingly, there are opportunities around new natural capital finance. So the challenge that we've raised, for example, is how do we channel some of the finance and value that's coming into Scotland land now, some of the new investment, and use that to unlock greater community ownership, rather than necessarily corporate or institutional ownership. And I think we're going to need to look, in a similar way to the governance, we're going to need to look a bit more imaginatively at how we bring some of these different finance sources together to support community land acquisition.
Thanks, Hamish. And I'm going to come back to you again, Hamish, and I'm just going to ask for a little bit of a kind of look forward on some of our natural capital work. So we haven't actually talked about that very much in the discussion this evening, but I think it's very relevant to some of the points that Alistair was making and some of the other points we've seen and some of the questions about these competing demands and how to decide what's best for land. So I just wondered if you'd be able to just share a little bit about some of the upcoming work that's going on and what might be coming up in the next couple of months.
Yeah, this has been a big focus for us, certainly over the last 18 months, and I think it will be still for the year ahead. I suppose there are at least two key parts to this. One is the question on land use change that we've already touched on, and the drive for net zero leading to significant land use change across Scotland, whether that's woodland expansion, peat restoration, etc. The other aspect is that, of course, this is creating quite a bit of new value in Scotland's land. We're seeing high prices in the land market because new value is being created. And Andrew touched on it earlier in terms of the role of carbon credits, for example, investors coming in, the degree of speculation in this. All the work that we've done suggests that if it is a bubble, it's not going to burst soon, and that high prices are likely here to stay. But I suppose more fundamentally, the policy direction of land use change is also here to stay. So the question, or one of the key questions that we've been grappling with is, well, who benefits from this new value in Scotland's land? How do we use it well? How do we share it fairly? And how do we make sure that it is there for the long term for local communities and economies and not extracted from Scotland through investment vehicles? So I think that's one of the key challenges. We have given some clear advice to government on this over the last year. We've recommended, for example, stronger regulation of the carbon market in terms of carbon credits. We have recommended some of the proposals that we expect to see coming forwards in the land reform bill in terms of the land ownership market itself. But we also think there's more to do, not just in the ownership and governance that we've talked about, in terms of getting more land into community and shared ownership and governance models. But also, for example, there's a lot that could be done through conditions on grants, forestry grants, others. The public support that government puts into land can also be used as quite a significant lever to help manage some of this change and manage where the value goes as well. So there's a whole set of issues there. We've published some advice that's in the link that are up in the chat. And I expect that we're going to be doing quite a lot more, particularly on the way that communities can benefit from this investment over the next few months.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Hamish. And I just wanted to touch on that because it is such a kind of key topic at the moment. And thanks to Alistair for his comment on the chat on that. Now, I'm going to just come to something slightly different now. So we had a question earlier from Murray, which we've touched on at different times throughout the evening. And he was talking about the kind of the community land ownership and management. A lot of it is undertaken by volunteers. And how can we reduce the burden of a quite considerable bureaucracy to what needs to be done so that more people want to become involved? And sometimes it just seems all too difficult. Now, we've kind of touched on this and we've covered it in different ways. But what I wanted to do was just kind of take this to ask you, Andrew, sort of thinking about this. Could you share a little bit about there are organisations out there to help, and we can sometimes signpost groups to the right organisation, and that's one thing we do. But what I thought it would just be useful would be to just give a brief overview of our good practice team and some of the work they do. So I was just going to ask Andrew if he could just talk about that a little bit just now.
Yeah, and I maybe say something else as well. But on the group practice team, first of all, so we've got, it's not a big team. Let's not get carried away. It's a very small number of people, but there is a huge amount of stuff on the website, lots and lots of guidance and protocols, some of which is relevant to community ownership, some not. So please look at the website, and then if that doesn't help you, then email us and we'll get someone to speak to you. So that's all there. And as you say, Sally, that we can signpost as well to, you know, this Community Land Scotland and many other places where you can get good help. I think it is worth, though, just reflecting on what are we trying to say here? Because I mean, of course, when the idea bobs up in your head that you're going to form a community group, you're going to form a development trust or a company, and you're going to try and buy a piece of land, and you're going to try and do whatever it is you're going to do, that is a pretty daunting prospect. And there's no question, I think, that the process of getting there, I mean, I'm not sure that bureaucratic is the right word. You know, it's no different from buying a house. I mean, there are various things you've got to go through. It's a bit more bureaucratic because you've got to have a constitution and you've got to try and raise money and all these sorts of things. I mean, it's hard work. I prefer to say it's hard work than bureaucratic. I'm not entirely sure it is bureaucratic. What is definitely true is if you try and go down one of the contested routes, so if you try and use one of the right to buy routes, then that does become quite bureaucratic, and rightly so, actually, because we live in a property owning democracy. And if you are going to force somebody to sell you something, there has to be a pretty good public interest reason for that. I think if we do not want to get to a place in this country where people who own things don't have confidence that they can invest in those things and they'll still own them. So we've got to be careful about rights to buy. So I think it should be the case that forcing someone to sell you something requires some quite high bars to be jumped. But once you've bought it, you can say more about this than I can, Sally, because you've done it and done it really well. But once you've bought the thing, and you know, I don't think it's like running anything. It depends what it is. I mean, it's probably more complicated in some ways to run a public toilet than it is to run a 500 acres. I don't really know. Maybe you should say something about
that. Thanks, Andrew. I was actually going to follow up by saying that before I became a land commissioner, a couple of times I was asked to tell my personal story of land and what it's meant to be. And so I was born and brought up on a croft. The estate where I lived was then purchased when I was a student. I wasn't actually living here at the time, so I was in my early 20s. And later in life, I became a development officer for a community landowner, not where I live, in a different part of the island. And it was a willing seller, and it was a very, very, very easy process because there is no easy process. It took 2 years from that first community meeting to when they purchased the land. And at the time, I think they were the fastest one in Lewis. They've been beaten now. So even a negotiated sale takes time, and it was hard work. And then everyone got there, and they bought the land, and they had a big party, and that was it. It was like, okay. But the next day, I started my job. You wake up and you've got to make that work, and you've got to run that, and you've got to have all your governance in place, and it's hard work, and you've got to do it. And you've got to have things like succession planning in place, as Alistair mentioned earlier. But I will say it is challenging and it is hard, but it brings with it confidence. And what you do see growing in those communities is confidence. And my personal, looking back on things here, there's always been a lot of community ownership here, not community land ownership, but community ownership of assets. So I don't think it's a coincidence that that moved on to community land ownership. That's just my personal opinion looking back. People had the confidence to take ownership of the land because they'd had confidence to take ownership of the asset, and they learned that confidence through ownership of the asset. There's lots of other things involved, but I think that's important. So I don't think you can underestimate the community confidence grows, but it is a chicken and egg thing, and it's really difficult until you get that confidence. But it is hard work. But where I've worked and where I've lived, I've seen very good results from it. And it's been the right thing for these communities. It may not be in other communities, but it has been the right thing here. So I'm going to pass to Andrew now. I don't know if you want to reflect back on that, if I covered that, while I have a quick look in the chat, because we've had a couple of questions come in.
No, I think we're fine with that. I mean, the community ownership will grow. We'll get better at it. But above all, what we have to do is challenge people who say, "Oh, it's all too difficult." And the reality is that communities all over Scotland have done remarkable things, and a lot of those communities have been disadvantaged communities. They've not been wealthy, they've been small, and so on and so forth. So, because I often hear it said, "Oh well, it's fine for sort of wealthy middle class communities with plenty of retired lawyers, they can do it," but that's not reality. The reality is that communities in very disadvantaged parts of Scotland have done really well at this, and it's brought enormous advantages. So a lot of this is about confidence. Sally, I know we're running out of time. So
no, that's okay. I'm going to do one. I'm going to ask Hamish to talk on one last question, and I can guarantee I don't come from one of those communities that Andrew just described. So certainly different communities can do things differently. And we've had a question come through just asking about if there's any kind of action plan or committee in place. And sorry to Hamish and Andrew, they can't see this. It's come through privately. So it's just to ask whether there's an action plan or committee in place to decide what happens with vacant and derelict land and properties in Inverness. For example, some of the examples that you mentioned in your presentation, Andrew. Now, I don't think Hamish is going to have an answer to that particular example, but I just thought it'd be quite interesting to talk a little bit about the Vacant and Derelict Task Force, which is just coming up to 3 years old and just about to be reviewed. So just if you've a very quick answer to that, Hamish, that'd be useful.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly for Inverness, clearly Highland Council will be a key contact there with an overview of the vacant derelict sites in Inverness. The sites should all be on the register, and Highland Council should have up-to-date information on the sites, including where possible ownership. So they're definitely the starting point. There has been a big shift in in activity across Scotland, actually, across towns and cities in Scotland, of bringing vacant and derelict sites back to life. Partly following the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force that we set up, and one of the results of that was an additional £50 million fund that the Scottish Government put in place for bringing sites back into productive use. I think it's also stimulated just a much stronger awareness of the need and the benefit of bringing these sites back into use. And possibly as well, a sense that actually it's just not acceptable to let these sites sit there for much longer in the state that they are. And that's a strong message from us through our good practice work for landowners, for developers, for anyone involved, actually, is that we simply shouldn't accept it as normal that these sites sit there in a derelict state with all the knock-on effects for the community and that. So if there are particular sites, there is a huge power that a community can bring to getting sites back into productive use. Certainly suggest discussing that with the council in the first instance. Other organisations like the Development Trusts, DTAS, Development Trust Scotland, will be able to help. And they also have some quite specific signposting experience and resources around vacant and derelict sites.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Hamish. And I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up now. So, and I've seen a couple of really good questions come in just now, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. So apologies for that, but we do have a recording of the chat. So where we can, we'll try and follow up on these, or if you'd like to get in touch with us directly, please do. I just want to say a really, really, really big thank you to you all. This has been a really, really interesting evening. Thank you to all of you for bearing with us. I'm sorry we haven't got through all of the questions, but it's been really interesting, and it's been really nice to hear actually a variety of real life examples, which really reiterate to us how important this work is and what's happening on the ground. So thank you for that. Thank you for participating, and thank you for your excellent questions. A big thank you to the panel, to Hamish and Andrew for joining me and for sticking with us as we get through this. And a very big thank you to Jess in the background, who have kept us right, kept everything working. I wouldn't manage to manage all this at the same time as chairing, so a very big thank you to Jess for that. This is absolutely a team effort, and to those before on the team, on the communications team, who advertise and get this all working. There will be a survey link, it's in the chat. We'd love to hear your feedback, and we would love to hear from more of you if you'd like to follow up on this. And we do these around about once a month, so we do them the length of Scotland, so we won't be back in Inverness too soon, but hopefully we will see you all at some point in the future to catch up on things. So finally, thank you all very much. Safe home, safe back to your kitchens, and have a nice tea.
Sally, could I just add something to it? Thank you very much for hosting an excellent evening. Really enjoyed it.
You're very welcome.
And thanks for the opportunity to put our industry's views across. We're at Kildun Farm, beside the Maryborough roundabout. If anyone wants to get in touch, come and visit us and discuss this in more detail. The door is always open. We're always here to talk, and I'd love to see folk, because I'm involved in community things in Dingwall. I'm facing the same issues you are with issues in Dingwall, and I'd love to get some forum could be set up where we can share experience. It would be brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alistair. That was great. And I do want to say a big thank you. Actually, I was in a meeting just yesterday as a land commissioner, and I had great input from NFUS on a completely different topic than one we've discussed tonight. And it's absolutely fantastic to hear from different agencies. So I think the kettle's always on at Alistair's farm. So I think pop in. So thank you very much. And I'm in Inverness next week, so you never know, I might pop in.
Sally, I would love to meet you. Give me a phone. I've sent my number. Cheers.
Thanks very much, and safe home, everybody, and thanks again for coming.
Thanks now. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.